Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm Alistair Horn, Social Media and Community Manager for Cambridge University Press ELT, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm very pleased to welcome back as today's presenter, Chris Redston, face-to-face author. I'm sure you all know Chris by now, but just in case you haven't been to any of his previous webinars, Chris has been a teacher and coursework writer for 25 years. And has taught in Turkey, Argentina, Italy, and the UK. He's just completed the second edition of Face to Face with his co-author, Gilly Cunningham. So I'm really glad we've got him back again today. Okay, over to you, Chris.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me again today for the fifth in this series of webinars. And as always, there seem to be people from all over the world here. I've noticed people joining us from Switzerland and from St. Petersburg and Moscow in Russia and Ireland and Brazil, and someone from Detroit. Welcome to you, and Czech Republic, the UAE, Croatia, Belarus, Brazil, and many other places too. So thank you all very much for joining me in this international occasion. Today, as you know, we're talking about grammar, in particularly how to present and practice new grammar in the classroom. I have these questions up, and people have been sending in some very interesting responses to these, which we'll come back to in a moment. First, though, here's just an outline of what we're going to be talking about in today's webinar. Firstly, we're going to look at meaning and form. Then we're going to discuss the guided discovery approach to teaching grammar, including some examples. Also, we'll be looking at the teacher's role in this stage of the lesson against the student's role, and also advantages of the guided discovery approach that we've just been looking at. Then we'll move on to some tips on how we can make control practice more communicative and meaningful. And finally, at the end, there'll be time for your questions. Okay, the first question I asked was, how can we help students understand the meaning of new grammar? So we're at the stage of the lesson where we're presenting some new grammar, and we want to check they understand the meaning. And a lot of these were mentioned in the feedback from our attendees in the chat box. Firstly, I think an important point is we need to use examples that come from a very clear context, e.g. from a listening or reading text. I know Tina said in the chat box, providing enough examples is very important, and I definitely agree with that. Also, we'll be looking at the importance of giving students very clear grammar rules so they know when to use a grammar and when it's incorrect. Also, asking concept questions to check meaning. So having shown the examples, we need to check they understand the meaning of those examples. If you're not sure about concept questions, we'll be looking at some examples soon. Also, to compare similar sentences, Haneke mentioned this in the chat box too, the importance of contrasting with other sentences, because often it's useful to help students understand what something means by showing them what it isn't. Also, using timelines, as Irina mentioned in the chat box, very useful for tenses and time-related grammar. And also, don't be afraid to compare the grammar with the student's first language if you have a monolingual class, and assuming you know the student's first language well enough to do this. This always used to be frowned upon a little bit, like there seemed to be some sort of rule you could never discuss the student's own language. But when you teach any grammar, you know that the students are already in their heads trying to work out if it's the same or different to their language. So I think with a monolingual class, there's no harm at all to compare it. Not only to show them what's different to English, but also what's the same. Because if they know the grammar is pretty much the same as English, that's a useful thing to know too. Okay, and how can we help students understand the form of new grammar? By form, I mean the structure, how you make it. I think putting examples into a table is very good for sentences, for tenses, question forms, and longer structures. And also, don't forget to teach the parts of speech when you're doing that. What's a past participle, what's an auxiliary, infinitive, which really helps students being more independent when they're checking this themselves. Also, make sure you give students clear paradigms, which is a posh word for the structure given word by word. For example, question word plus did plus subject plus infinitive is a paradigm for past simple questions. So they have a structure and a paradigm to base their examples on. Also, as we've mentioned, comparing similar sentences is useful for form as well as for grammar. And don't forget to teach any exceptions to the rules. Okay, in my time, 25 years or something, teaching English, and also my experience all those many years ago back at school, there seem to be two ways to teach grammar. The first is a very teacher-led approach, which is what my schooling was like, and also what teachers often seem to want to do when they're teaching new grammar. This basically is the teacher stands at the front of the class and explains the grammar to the students. The teacher has the knowledge and imparts the knowledge to the students. The students listen, take notes, and if they're lucky, they can get to ask questions at the end. So this is a very traditional approach. The other approach is having a very student-led approach. In this type of approach, students try and work out the rules of meaning and form themselves. And Mohammed said in the chat box earlier that one of his key things of teaching grammar was helping them to discover the rule. So this is what we're moving on to now. So after they've worked on the rules of meaning and form, they then check their ideas with the course book or with their teacher. And we call this student-led approach a guided discovery approach. So through clear examples and very directed questions, we guide the students to discover the grammar of the new grammar that we're teaching that day. So the guided discovery approach to teaching grammar is what we, Gilly and I, particularly wanted to include in face-to-face, as we feel it's really the best way to teach grammar in the classroom. And the key principle of a guided discovery approach to teaching grammar is this. Students are much more likely to understand and remember new grammar if they've actively tried to work out the rules of meaning and form themselves, rather than just being given or told them. And this is not just we think. There's been lots of research into this that shows that if students try and work out the rules themselves, they remember them much better. And that's true even if during the working out they get a few things wrong, because when they get it wrong, it's pointed out and then they can correct it. Okay, now we're going to have a look at a few examples of how the guided discovery approach works in practice. Okay, this is a part of a lesson from the starter second edition of Face-to-Face, which is teaching going to. And as we always try and do, we want to make sure the examples are really clear and also very contextualized. So they're not just random sentences appearing out of nowhere. So in this example, the first thing we ask people to do is to look at the photos of 4 students who are studying English in different parts of the world, then read and listen to them. Read and listen to Isabella, Camille, Ali and Colette, and decide where does each person study English. We'll just look at the first one. This is Isabella, who's from Brazil. And you would read and listen to what she says. Okay, and then of course the listening goes on to include the other three people. And as you'll see from that, there are lots of examples of going to within the text. So we now have a clear context, and the next thing we would do is ask students to read the text again and fill in the gaps with the correct names. So there's a little reading exercise that follows on there too. Okay, so having done the skills work of listening and reading, we now move on to the grammar section. The first thing we ask students to do is look again at the sentences in 2B, and then choose the correct phrase in this rule. So this is just checking meaning. So students have to decide if we use be going to plus verb to talk about the past, the present, or future plans, which of course is future plans. And we're going to, the concept is fairly easy for everybody, but the difficult thing is the form. So this is how we would approach the form. We'd ask students to look at these sentences and notice the word order. So it shows the subject, the auxiliary, going to, the infinitive, and the rest of the sentence. So it shows example of a positive sentence and a negative sentence. And then we ask students to write these sentences from the text into the correct tables. So students have to move those into the blank lines in the tables. Then they can check in the language summary. So a key point about this grammar section is the teacher isn't doing this for the students are doing this themselves. So this is an exercise that students would do on their own or in pairs by referring to the previous examples. So it's student-led, not teacher-led. And then if they check in the grammar summary, they will see this section, which first shows the rule at the top and then has the completed table, so they can check their answers. So this is using a guided discovery approach of them having a go themselves, checking their answers, and then the teacher would check they've got them all correct. Here's another example of the same approach from elementary. Here we're looking at presenting for the first time the present perfect for experience. So we're basing this on three friends, Steve, Lucy, and Guy, who are self-employed. And the first time we'd ask them to listen and read about three friends and decide if they like being self-employed. And here is the first text that they would read. I'll just give you 1 second to read it through yourself. Okay, so that's what Steve says, and there's a similar text about Lucy and Guy who run a restaurant. Then we ask them to look at the grammar, which is built into the text. And as you can see, the key grammar is in blue in the text to help students find it. So again, this is a section we ask the students to do on their own or in pairs, not as a whole class. So the students look at sentences 1 and 2, which are taken from Steve's text, then answer the two questions. So in sentence 1, do we know when Steve went to these countries? Answer, no. In sentence 2, do we know when he went to Mexico? Answer, yes, 2 weeks ago. So this highlights the key difference between present perfect and past simple. Having worked that out themselves, students will now be able to fill in the gaps in the rule. So they can now say that we use the present perfect to talk about experiences in life until now, and we don't say when that happened. And we use the past simple if we say when something happens. And then finally, having dealt with meaning, we're now checking they understand the form They have to look at the examples in blue in the text and complete the table with the correct parts of the auxiliary have. And finally, having done that, we ask them to check their answers in the language summary in the back of the book. There are also some rules for making past participles as well. So when they go to the language summary, this is what they see. Firstly, they have the two bullets which have the rules and the examples that they looked at, so they can check they got present perfect for the first one, past simple for the second. Then we give the paradigm for the positive form of the present perfect, including 3 examples from the text. Again, all color-coded, because that really helps students at lower levels see how the grammar is put together. Then we have a negative version of the table, which has the negative paradigms and 3 examples from the text. And there's also a little tip about using never as well. Okay, so again, the students have tried this themselves. Then they would check their answers in the language summary. And I would expect most students, if not all students, would get all that correct, because we do try very hard to make sure the examples are clear and the questions are very specific, so it sets students up for success when they do these kind of activities. Here's a third example. This is moving up the levels to pre-intermediate of a lesson which is teaching present perfect, but for a different meaning. This is present perfect with for or since. And the topic of the lesson is unusual homes. Again, we would start by doing some skills work on the text so that they understand the context of all the examples they're going to be working with. So first we ask them to look at the photos. One guy lives in a lighthouse, the woman lives in a motorhome, and think what is the best thing about each home. Then we ask them to read and listen to the text and decide what they think is the best thing about their homes and see if it's correct to what the students' ideas are. So have a listen to this. And what's the best thing about their homes?
We first met when we were living in Houston, Texas, married for 12 years. In Houston, I was a waitress and Larry worked in a factory, but we both lost our jobs at the same time. After that, we decided that we didn't want to live in one place all the time. We've lived in our motorhome since 2008, and we really love it. It's quite spacious, and we've got central heating and air conditioning, so it's very comfortable. The best thing about it is that when we need to find work, we just drive to a new town.
Okay, so I'm sure you gathered that the best thing about Angus's lighthouse is the view, and the best thing about Meg's motorhome is that when they need to find work, they can just drive to a new town. So this gives very clear context of the target language that we're teaching. And I think if the context is very clear, then half the meaning is already implicit. And all we need to do is check students have understood the language. We then ask students to read the text again, ask a few more specific questions about where the lighthouse is, and what he does for a living, why is he fit, etc. And then we move on to the grammar box. And I've put these on a separate slide so we can look at what's happening in the grammar box and how it relates to the examples in a little bit more detail. So again, don't forget, this is a section students are being asked to do on their own, or if you prefer, in pairs. So the first thing we wanted to do is look at phrases 1 and 2 in Angus's text and answer these questions. So here are some good examples of concept questions. So does Angus live in Glasgow now? The answer, of course, is no. Does he live in a lighthouse now? The answer is yes. And what are the verb forms in phrases 1 and 2? Number 1 is past simple, number 2 is present perfect. So this is guiding students to the differences between the two tenses. And by understanding that, they should be able to complete these rules so that they can say we use the past simple to talk about something that started and finished in the past, and we use the present perfect to talk about something started in the past and continues in the present. And as this is the third time they've met present perfect in face-to-face, we don't have a big form table again. We just check they remember how to make positive and negative sentences. And then moving on to for and since, which is new at this stage of the course, we asked them to look at phrases 3 and 4, which are in Meg's text. Then fill in the gaps in the rules with for or since. So students should be able to work out we use for with a period of time, i.e. how long, and we use since with a point of time, when something started. Then, of course, we ask them to go to the language summary in the back of the book and check their answers. So when they go to the language summary, this is what they'll find. The first thing they'll do is check the rule. So we use the past simple. Again, this is in bold, which helps them find their answers. And also we've included some timelines here, which show the now and lived is something that's completed in the past. And as people mentioned earlier, timelines are very useful for this kind of language to show visual learners in particular the relationship between tenses. There's the same thing for the present perfect, which shows that have lived continues up to now. And for is a period of time, which shows, again, that continues up to now. We've been married for 12 years. And since is a point of time when something started. So the timelines help students understand the relationship between the tenses and for and since. Okay, so there are 3 examples of the guided discovery kind of in practice. And let's pause for a moment and have a look what's really happening in the class, i.e. what the teacher's doing and what the students are doing. So after doing the initial skills work on reading or listening a short text which has some contextualized examples, the teacher needs to focus the students on their help with grammar section and also remind the students where the examples are. We either put them in the text or they can be in the comprehension questions or sometimes they're in the beginning of the box. It depends how the language is presented. And then the teacher should step back and let the students do the work. So the students go through the exercises in the help with grammar section on their own or in pairs and referring back to the examples where necessary. So this is very student-centered. What we're trying to avoid is a teacher standing at the front of the class giving a long lecture about the grammar. What we're trying to do is get the students to work out the grammar themselves. While they're doing that, the teacher can be monitoring and helping with any problems. So if any students are really stuck or they're doing the wrong exercise, the teacher can make sure that they can put them on the right track. Also, the teacher can write the examples or draw the blank form tables on the board ready for checking. This is something you can do while the students are working on their own during the guided discovery section. So when the students have done all the exercises, they can check the answers themselves in the language summary. I think it's important that they try and do all the exercises before they check in the language summary. If they try and check after each mini exercise, they'll see the answers to all the other questions anyway, so it might be less useful for them. So they do all the exercises, then check the answers themselves. And finally, the teacher checks the answers with the whole class using the board if necessary. And that's when the teacher can deal with any problems, any questions, clarify anything students aren't sure about, etc. So the teacher's role really is setting up the activity, monitoring what they're doing, and checking they've got it right. And what the students are doing is working out the grammar themselves by using the clear examples and the concept questions, timelines, examples, rules, etc. that we give them. Let's have a look how this might work at a higher level. And I'll kind of get you to do some of this as well, as it's a lesson that works on the second conditional. Okay, this is how the grammar section will start, again by using some skills activities. There are 3 pictures there of Judy, who's the company director, Wesley, who's a cafe owner, and Frank, who's a sales manager. So first we ask students to look at the photos and decide why they think the internet is important to each person's company. Because this lesson and the unit in general is about the use of the internet. Then we'd ask students to listen and check their answers, and we also ask them to decide what disadvantages of the internet does each person talk about. Okay, then the second time, we'd ask students to match these sentences to the peoples in the photos. So I'll just give you a few seconds to have a go at this on your own. I'm making it a bit harder for you because you haven't heard the recording yet, but it would still be interesting to see if you could get these right. So I'll just give you a few seconds to try and match these sentences to the 3 people in the photos. Is it Judy, Wesley, or Frank? Okay, now I'm going to play the recording. Check your answers. See if you've managed to match these sentences to the correct people.
Another company that makes personalized gifts. Basically, people send us their photos online and we put them on posters, t-shirts, bangles, nice masks, that kind of thing. All of our customers order online. If the internet didn't exist, we wouldn't have a business. The most important part of the company is our website, because that's how everyone sees their order. We use a lot of content of our website. It's a very cheap business to run. The only thing I don't like about it is that I'm not attracted to think more. So I'll just online order or email. I'd like to talk to a real customer again, face to face.
I've owned this cafe for 12 years, and I've found that the internet is essential for my business. There's an art college across the road, and the students come in there all the time, check their email or whatever. If we didn't have Wi-Fi, this place would be empty. I don't even need a password to log on, but it does mean people talk less than us. Sometimes I look round and nobody's talking to each other. They're all online, they're on the computer. If they turned off the computer, they might make some new friends. But it also means they stay longer and spend more money. So I can't complain about it. I'm a sales manager for a sports book. I've got all my personal stuff on there, and a lot of information about the company. Unless my laptop, a job. One thing that's changed is that a lot of my meetings are online. In some ways, they're great because they save time. But of course, this means I hardly ever play. I used to enjoy visiting other places. I saw them online to get out of the office.
Okay, so there are our three characters talking, and it was very nice to hear some different accents in there, as with the other one. Judy, you may have spotted, is from Scotland, and Wesley is from the Midlands in Birmingham, which is where I come from originally, where everyone talks like this. So it's nice to hear someone from Birmingham in an English language book for a change, because you don't normally get our accent in there. I'll go back to my normal voice now. So the answers, if you want to check the answers, is sentence 1 was Frank, the sales manager. Sentence 2 was Judy, the company director. Sentence 3 was Wesley, the cafe owner. Sentence 4 was Judy. Sentence 5 was Wesley. Sentence 6 was Frank. And of course, what we're doing there is we're giving students 6 examples of second conditional sentences, which aren't just plucked from the air. They're part of a listening exercise, which they've already listened to for content, and they know the characters. So the meaning of the conditional sentences is implicit because they know where they've come from. Then the next thing we'll do is move the students onto the help with grammar section. Again, I've taken this out, put it on a separate slide, and had so we got the exercise we've just done on the left, 2C, and the grammar section that the students will do on their own or in pairs on the right. So the first thing we ask them to do is to look at sentences 1 to 4 in 2C and choose the correct words in these words or phrases in these roles. Again, I'll just give you 15, 20 seconds to do this on your own. Okay, hopefully that's enough time for you to do that one. Then the next thing I would ask the students to do is look at these 2 sentences. And this comes back to something we were talking about earlier of comparing 2 sentences. It is very useful to compare these 2 first and second conditional sentences. So again, look at these sentences, then answer the questions. I'll give you another 10 or 15 seconds to do that. Okay, then the next section is we ask them to look at sentences 5 and 6. And which modal verbs can we use in the main clause to mean would perhaps, or would be able to? So this is looking at a couple of very common variations of the second conditional. And finally, we'd ask the students to just fill in the gaps in these questions, second conditional questions. The first one is a WH question, the second is a yes-no question. And also, what are the short answers for question 2? And finally, we'd ask the students to check in the language summary. And I'm sure you found all that fairly easy, but it was trying to give you an idea of what it's like being a student being faced with these questions. And although there's quite a lot to think about in second conditional, this is broken down into meaning, checking meaning, and then looking at form. So when they go to the language summary, the first thing we do is check the basic meaning, that we use a second conditional to talk about imaginary situations, and the second conditional talks about the present or the future. And again, the answers students have had to do are in bold, so they can check that. Also, we've included this bit just to clarify that we often use a second conditional to talk about the opposite of what's true or real. Like if we didn't have Wi-Fi, the place would be empty. But we do have Wi-Fi, so this is an imaginary situation. Then we clarify the form, if plus past simple, would or wouldn't plus infinitive with some examples. And then we check the answers to when they compare the sentences. The first one being a first conditional is a real possibility. The second one is an imaginary situation. A person can't buy a new laptop. Then we highlight the two different alternatives for conditionals that we use might to mean would perhaps, or could for would be able to, which are both very common structures and feels like they should be taught at intermediate level. And finally, we check the question forms. What would you do if? Or if someone would you do it? And the short answers, of course, are yes, I would, no, I wouldn't, or maybe yes, I might. Okay, so the student checks those answers, and then the teacher can clarify any problems. Okay, so another question for you to think about. What are the advantages of using a guided discovery approach for new grammar? Just have a think about that, add your ideas to the chat box while I have a drink. Water, obviously. Okay, some good answers coming through, and as we were saying before, the students remember better because they've worked it out themselves. Makes it much more memorable, says Barbara. They're not just passive listeners, because as I'm sure you know, if students just have to listen for too long, they just switch off. And if they infer their rules themselves, so they're learning instead of sleeping, which I like that one. And very important, yes, they're taking charge of their learning, says Chad, and encourages lifelong learning. Okay, here are some of the points that I added. I think a lot of these have been mentioned, and here are some more advantages, I think, of a guided discovery approach. As we said, the students are actively working out the rules of meaning and form themselves, so they'll remember them better. And this has been shown to be true. Another good thing about it is checking the answers themselves gives them a genuine reason to read the language summary in the back of the book. All books have language summaries in the back, but we try and make it really work with the with the grammar section in the lesson. So they actually read in to check their answers. Unlike some other books, which just ask students to go to the language summary and learn more about the present perfect, which kind of seems to not really be focused enough for me. So we try really hard to make sure that the students really engage with the language summary and not just have to just read it for no particular reason. And as people have mentioned, it's student-centered, encourages learner independence, lifelong learning, and takes the pressure off the teacher and avoids long teacher-centered grammar lectures. This is also a very useful approach for teaching old grammar they've done before. I'm sure you've all had this situation where teachers say, okay, we're doing the present perfect today, and some students say, I do this already. And they think, yeah, okay, well, let's see how good you are. Rather than trying to teach it all themselves, they're actually challenging stronger students by doing a guided discovery approach and also supporting weaker ones. So it's a very good way of kind of testing stronger. Okay, you think you know this, let's see. And also, very importantly, there's less planning for the teacher. You don't have to plan how to do your 15-minute sort of lecture on the grammar on the board. You can just let the course book do the work and check the answers. Okay, after the guided discovery grammar stage, what comes next? Well, normally people do pronunciation. It was always meaningful and pronunciation when I did teacher training. And they students need practice in saying the language. I'm not going to talk about that anymore because the next webinar is all about pronunciation, so I'll leave my comments till then. After that, students need controlled practice, which gives students a chance to use and manipulate the language. Of course, we all know the aim of controlled practice is accuracy, to get the language correct. But does it always have to be boring gap-fill exercises in the back of the student's book? I always used to find them very dull to teach. If all you have in the back is some random sentences, you have to fill in the gaps, check the answers. Students can do that kind of thing in the workbook at home. There are better ways to use class time. So what we need to think about is how can we make controlled practice more communicative and meaningful? This also touches on what I said, I think, in the second webinar, which was about speaking practice. So if you were with me then, this is reviewing and extending some of the ideas we talked about then. I think it's very important that students still need to do controlled writing exercises, things like gap fills, putting words in order, choose a correct word to help their accuracy. They're absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with those. But I think we need to take these activities off the page and turn them into interesting, meaningful speaking activities in the classroom. So it's not just a gap fill, check the answers. They need to be productive as well as controlled practice and checking accuracy. I think it's also really important to personalize these exercises so students can talk about themselves, people they know, and their opinions and experiences, so that they can really personalize the new grammar that they have learned as well. And I'll just have a look at a few examples of these types of controlled practice exercises that actually go further than the average gap fill. Here's an example of on the going to lesson we were talking about before. For practicing the questions, we ask students to make questions with these words. A standard type of exercise. But because they all have the word you in there, it means that after they have done the drill, which practices that they can say them correctly, it becomes a communicative speaking activity, where students work in pairs, ask and answer the questions, so they're actually having a real conversation, almost immediately having done the control practice. Also note here, we ask students to make notes on their partner's answers. And this is because the final part of the exercise, we ask them to work in new pairs and talk about their partner from the previous exercise. So this immediately doubles the amount of speaking practice that students do. And also means they go from asking questions to saying sentences with he and she. So you're practicing different parts of the verb to be in the be going to structure. So Juan is going to meet some friends after class also. So they have to do that manipulation, which, although still very controlled, is still meaningful and communicative. So doing these follow-up, ask questions in pairs, tell a new partner the answer is a very useful way, and it's something we try and do in face-to-face a lot to make control practice much more communicative and meaningful. Again, here's one for the second conditional, which is our practice for the lesson we were talking about earlier, about the three businesses. As you might expect, the first thing they have to do is fill in the gaps with the correct form of the verbs. So which one is would plus infinitive, which one is past simple. And sometimes it's at the beginning, sometimes it's in the middle, so they have to think a bit. So this is a standard thing, and they have questions, you ask each other the questions. But how much better it works by giving student A and student B different questions. So student B has a different set of questions to ask student A. So this means when you get to the second part, where they work with their partner, ask and answer the questions, they don't know what they're being asked. So it makes it a much more interesting and much more communicative activity. And of course, we try and get them to continue the conversation if they can. So again, both of these, having student A set, student B set, and continuing the conversation, really extends a speaking activity and turns a heads down gap fill activity into something that's really communicative, lively, and fun. Here's another example here of the, this is a practice for the present perfect about two people who have jobs and they're self-employed. So here you have to write, the student has to write 6 sentences about your experiences using the prompts. So they have to make it positive or negative, remember the past participle, etc. As shown in the 2 examples. So it's up to the students whether they choose a positive or a negative sentence. So it's not just a gap fill about random people, it's about the students. Then we ask them to work in groups and tell other students their sentences and how many are the same. So this again turns what is basically a controlled writing exercise into something that is more communicative and more personalised. And this is a practice for the for and since lesson that we looked at earlier, where students have to decide if it's past simple or present perfect, and then complete the sentences that are almost all for and since. There are 4 out of 6 are for and since. So they have to decide how they finish that sentence. So I've lived in my home since 2006 or whatever. Then we ask them to work in pairs and compare sentences. And a similar approach for another lesson which teaches first conditional and time clauses with unless, before, after. This is one where we give them sentence stems and they have to complete the sentences for them. Then they work in pairs and take turns to say their sentences. So sentence stems is another good way of producing interesting communicative control practice. Okay, so how we make control practice more communicative and meaningful? We use exercises such as gap fills, choose the correct tense, etc., that can turn into speaking activities. So the gap fills only stage 1. The communicative part of the activity follows on from that. We try and personalize these exercises if possible. Also, it's very important to give students, if we can, different sentences or questions to student A and B, which makes it much more interesting in the speaking stage. If students sort of are speaking in pairs and they realize they're getting new questions, they think, okay, I'm really having to think about this, and makes it's much more challenging and interesting in the class. Also, the idea of extending the speaking by putting students in new pairs to report the previous conversation can double the practice and also give students very useful and necessary practice of he and she forms, particularly at lower levels. Okay, so just to summarize what we've been talking about today, how can we help students with grammar? Firstly, we can provide examples of new grammar in a clear context, in a reading and listening or a listening text. And almost all the language we teach in face-to-face, we start by having it contextualized in a text. We make sure we deal with the content of the text first before moving on to the grammar. So they know the characters, they know the situation, they know if it's past, present, and future, and all that underpins the meaning. And very importantly, we use a guided discovery approach to grammar, which lets the students work out the rules themselves. And we've already talked about the many advantages of this approach. Then we check the students' answers with the class and deal with any Any problems? And finally, it's important to provide controlled practice that's both communicative and personalised. And if we do all that, we set students up for success, that the grammar is something they will remember, and they will, because they've really been involved in working it out, they'll be able to remember and use it more successfully. Okay, that's all we have time for on the grammar. And just before I take any questions that you're sending in, let me just remind you of our, the final webinar in this set of webinars before the summer is about pronunciation. Say it again, Sam. Helping students with pronunciation. This is on Tuesday, June the 10th, again at 3 p.m. UK time, so probably the same time as it is now, wherever you are. Also, if you've missed any of my webinars, you can catch up with them via these links, the YouTube. They're on the YouTube Cambridge UP ELT site. Okay, I'll leave that up there if you need to copy those down. And if anyone has any questions, I'm sure Alistair is ready to pass them on to me.
Indeed I am, Chris. And the first question we've got is from Hamid Shujat, who asks, at what level do you think the guided discovery approach best works with?
Oh, that's a very good question, actually. We debated this a lot when we were writing these books, and we've basically used it in all the levels apart from the first two-thirds of starter level, the beginner level. We did experiment with it, but we found that actually the questions we were needing to ask students to do the guided discovery were actually harder than the language they were trying to learn. So it's only in the last 2 or 3 units of starter that we encourage the students to do this themselves. Otherwise, it's more given than work it out. We're talking about the very basic sort of to be and there is, there are, etc. So I would say from kind of late beginner and certainly into elementary, I think as long as the material really guides students clearly to the answers, you can use it with anything from late beginner, elementary, all the way up. And I think it becomes particularly important at the higher levels where, you know, once you get to upper intermediate, students have done most of the grammar that there is in English. And if you try and present it all at the front of the class, they'll get kind of bored and switch off. So the guided discovery approach at higher levels, upper intermediate, advanced, is again very useful because it really tests students' knowledge. So it's much more of a testing phase of the lesson. Like, do you know all these bits of grammar that you should know? So to summarize, all levels apart from sort of early starter, I would say.
Okay, thanks. Another question now from Tatiana Rupina, who I think was intrigued by the variety of accents we had. And she asks, what do you think about introducing so many different accents at, say, the starter level?
At the starter level, we don't do that quite so much. In all the levels, we make sure we always have some British and standard British, standard American, standard Australian, and other countries where English is the first language, maybe South African, Canadian, etc., language accents. And in the higher levels, we introduce 1 or 2 more regional accents like Scottish or the Birmingham accent we had there is the only one in the course, which I'm very proud of. And the Southern, the American accent we had was a Southern American accent, not the standard New York or Californian accent. I think it's very important, but I don't think this should be overdone at lower levels. You'll find at elementary and starter, almost all the accents are RP, or received pronunciation, standard English accents. And I think, particularly at starter elementary, it's hard enough to understand English, but to make the accents too complicated at that level is very is making things a bit too tricky for students. So at low levels, we generally have very standard accents. And at higher levels, we try and introduce a bit of variety.
Okay, thanks. Got another question now from Barbara Gardner, who queried your suggestion that this approach would lead to less planning in lessons. She wondered whether perhaps it would be a different form of planning, but you'd need to spend more time anticipating the difficulties that students would have, and that time could perhaps be spent actually improving the teacher's own grasp of the concept as a result.
Yes, true. I mean, obviously it depends on the experience of the teacher and the level of the students, etc. I think the point I was trying to make is that because all the concept questions and the form and examples and meaning are all built into the lesson, the teacher can really just let the Help with Grammar box do its work, and you don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel and present it again. As a teacher trainer, I've watched dozens, if not hundreds of lessons where the trainees have spent hours trying to work out how to put all this language on the board. And they end up doing these sort of quite long exercise presentations of all the language they've learned, whereas it would be much better to give it over to the students, let them work it out. And yes, it does mean you need to be completely comfortable with all the grammar yourself, but I think maybe one of the best ways to do this is put yourself in the student's shoes and work through the Help with Grammar box yourself first and see where the students might be having problems, particularly compared to their native language if you have a monolingual class. But I take your point. Depending on the teacher and the level, it might mean a little bit of different kind of planning. But hopefully most of the problems they have we've anticipated either in the Help with Grammar box or in the tips that are in the language summary.
Okay, thanks. A question now from Danusz Vimitalkova, who asks how familiar do you expect students to be with the names of parts of speech and grammar forms, etc.? Because all these sort of formal explanations require knowledge of these terms of grammar.
I think it's very important that when you're teaching any new grammar, you teach them what we call them. So you teach the names of the tenses, you teach what is a past participle, what's a preposition, what's an adjective, etc. Not only because it gives you the kind of meta language that you and the students need to talk about grammar while you're correcting them. If they don't know the difference between a past participle and the past simple, the infinitive, it's very hard to correct them if they make a mistake. But also I think that when they're not in class and they're working on their own, either with the self-study CD-ROM, or if they're doing a grammar book, they need to be able to look up these terms. So I think it's part of our job when we're teaching grammar, we teach what it's called. So this is called a second conditional. If you want to research it more, go to a grammar book, look up second conditional. And if you start this right at the beginning, it's not too daunting for students. They pick it up as they go along. And they like having something they can hang on to and to have names for the parts of speech. So I'd suggest you do this as part of a standard grammar presentation, however you would approach it. They need to know the names of the parts of speech and the tenses and the structures, etc.
Great, thanks. Just trying to fit in one quick further question. We had a couple of people asking about some student frustration and students lacking motivation. How do you think you can make guided discovery work when your students lack motivation, when they're not really engaged? How do you get around that?
Maybe you could turn it into some kind of competition. Like, for example, in some of those, there were like 6 or 7 different questions. You could get them to work through the questions and the gap fills and everything. But before they go to the language summary, you could just check the answers and see how many people got them all right. Most students, well, some students anyway, are more motivated if they feel they're being a bit competitive. I think another way to do it is if you get students to have a look on their own quickly and then put them in pairs and to compare their answers, because they're always kind of Okay, oh, he's got that and I haven't, and so that might help them kind of be motivated that they want to be as good as their partner. I mean, also the other thing is if you have classes that find this approach maybe not very motivating, I think the other thing to note is this, because these are quite short and succinct and based on examples, it shouldn't take too long in the class, particularly at lower levels. But it doesn't mean that you can't mix things up a bit and occasionally do a teacher-led presentation to break up the types of lessons. But I think that students are always motivated, in my experience, by getting things right. So I think in terms of asking how many questions they get right might be one way of motivating them to work things out for themselves.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Chris. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but in 2 weeks' time, on May the 20th, we'll be joined by Herbert Puchter for a session on emotional engagement for adult learners. And then on June the 3rd, Daniel Lowe will be discussing the benefits of blended learning. And then on June the 10th, Chris will be back for the last in this series of webinars, and he'll be looking at pronunciation in a session called, as it says on screen, Say It Again, Sam, Helping Students with Pronunciation. And we'll be posting links to all those sessions in the chat box now. So thanks very much. Thanks particularly to you, Chris, for another fascinating session. And we'll see you back next month.
Thank you all very much for being here today. Have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you again on the 10th. Bye.
Bye.